20. The Canted Circle. The stage was set. A perfect circle, 20 meters in diameter, had been cut from a single slab of imported stone and constructed so that one end touched the floor, while the other was held 10 degrees above it by concealed anti-grav generators. This was the Canted Circle, known only to members of the Order, which, throughout its long history, had never numbered more than 500 in any given period, and was housed in the clear-domed summit of the Esoteric Society's monad in the heart of Coruscant's Phobosy district. Legend had it that the round-topped building, thought to be one of the oldest in that part of the planet, was built over an ancient lake bed and had been the sole survivor of a seismic event that had tipped it 10 degrees to the southwest. A century after the quake, the structure had been righted to vertical, except for the central portion of the canted floor of its uppermost story, which later supplied the name for a clandestine organization founded by influential beings who had purchased the building sometime during the reign of Tarsus Valorum. Just then, Larsh Hill, draped in black robes, was standing at the raised end of the circle, and Plagueis, 11-4D, and 10 other moons, also wearing black garments, though different from the Order's hooded garb, stood at the other. Scheduled to begin at the top of the hour, the initiation ceremony would commence with the high official joining Hill on the circle, initiating him, and placing around his neck the Order's signature pendant. Plagueis had declined an offer of enrollment 20 years earlier, but had continued to do business with the Grand Mage and many of the Order's most prominent members, several of whom were regulars at the gatherings on Sojourn. The Order of the Canted Circle was content to serve as an exclusive club for some of the galaxy's most influential beings. Its aims were narrow in focus, and its rituals universally allegorical, replete with secret phrases and handshakes. Plagueis understood the need to instill members with a sense of furtive fraternity, but he couldn't risk having the high officials dig too exhaustively into his background. Larsh Hill's past, on the other hand, was exemplary, even the decades he had spent working with Plagueis's father. Once initiated, Hill would become Damask Holdings' principal agent on Coruscant, and his son, San, would become Higo's right hand, in preparation for his eventual role as chairman of the Intergalactic Banking Clan. Returned from the short holo communication with Sidious, Plagueis was filled with a sense of triumph. Before night fell on the Phobosy district, the members of the Grand Protectorate would cease to be a concern. Pax's team and the rest believed they had found shelter aboard one of Coruscant's orbital facilities, but the Sun Guards, save for a pair Plagueis had kept in reserve in the Order's initiation room, were on the way to them now, in forces sufficient to crush whatever defenses Santhe security might be providing. Sidious had played his part perfectly, and had redeemed himself fully in Plagueis's eyes. The time had come to bring his apprentice deeper into the Sith mysteries he had been investigating for most of his life, to introduce him to the miracles he was performing on Abora. From a series of arch-topped doorways lining the circumference of the room came the sounds of solemn chanting, as perhaps 36 of the Order's black-robed members began to file in and take their places along the perimeter of the Canted Circle. Last to emerge was the High Official, who wore a mask and carried the circular, emblematic pendant draped over both hands, which he held as if in prayer. Rituals of a similar sort had been enacted by the ancient Sith, Plagueis thought, as Larsh Hill genuflected before the High Official. At the same instant, Hill's right knee touched the polished stone. A jangle of foreboding laddered up Plagueis's spine. Turning ever so slightly, he saw that 11-4D had rotated its head toward him in a gesture Plagueis had come to associate with alarm. The dark side fell over him like a shroud, but instead of acting on impulse, he restrained himself, fearful of betraying his true nature prematurely. In that instant of hesitation, time came to a standstill, and several events happened at once. The High Official gave a downward tug to the pendant he had placed around Hill's neck, and the old Mune's head toppled from his shoulders and began to roll down the tip stage. Blood geysered from Hill's neck, and his body fell to one side with a thud, and began to jerk back and forth, as one after another of his hearts failed. Yanking their hands from the roomy opposite sleeves of their robes, the hooded members of the Order made sidelong throwing motions, which sent dozens of decapitator discs screaming through the air. Munes to both sides of Plagueis fell to their knees, their last breaths caught in their throats. a disc buried deep in his forehead. One of the sun guards twirled in front of Plagueis like a crazed marionette. Blood fountained, turning to mist. Struck in at least 3 places and leaking lubricant, 11-4D was trying to limp to Plagueis' side when another disc whirled into its alloy body, touching off a storm of sparks and smoke. Plagueis pressed his right hand to the right side of his neck to discover that a disc had made off with a considerable hunk of his jawbone and neck, and in its cruel passing had severed his trachea and several blood vessels. He cupped the force against the injury to keep himself from lapsing into unconsciousness, but he fell to the floor regardless, with blood pumping onto the already slick stone circle. Around him, slanted in his faltering vision, the assassins had drawn vibroblades from the other sleeves of the robes and were beginning a methodical advance on the few Munes who were still standing. A hail of bolts streaked from the blaster cradled in the arms of the remaining sun guard, sweeping half a dozen hooded beings off the rim of the circle before he himself was butchered. Tricked, Plagueis thought, as pained by the realization as he was by the wound. Outmaneuvered by a group of inferior beings who at least had had sense enough to place artfulness above arrogance. In his small but orderly Senate office, Palpatine gazed out on a sliver of Coruscant. On the far side of a ceaseless current of mid-tier traffic was the sheer cliff face of a drab government complex. "Go about your usual business," Plagueis said. But how could he be expected to behave as if nothing had happened, even in the interest of establishing an alibi? Did Plagueis expect him to return to the Escrew and finish lunch? Go for a stroll in Monument Plaza? Keep his appointment to meet with the inconsequential Bothan who chaired the Finance Committee? He stormed away from the office window, victim of his own unreleased rage. This was not the life he had imagined for himself 10 years earlier, when he had sworn loyalty to the dark side of the Force. His hunger to be in closer contact with the Force, to be an even more powerful Sith, knew no bounds. But how was he to know when he had arrived at some semblance of mastery? When Plagueis told him? He regarded his trembling hands. Would his ability to summon lightning come more effortlessly? What powers had Sith Lord Plagueis kept to himself? He was standing in the center of the room when he sensed someone in the corridor outside. Fists pummeled the door, then it slid to one side and Saint Pestage burst into the room. Seeing Palpatine, he came to a sudden stop, and the panicked look he wore on entering transformed to one of visible relief. "I've been trying to reach you," he nearly screamed, running a hand over his forehead. Palpatine regarded him quizzically. "I was occupied. What has happened?" Pestage sank into a chair and looked up at him. "Are you sure you want to know?" He paused, then said, "In the interest of separating what I do from what you do." Palpatine's eyes blazed. "Stop wasting my time and come to the point." Pestage gritted his teeth. "The Maladian commander I did business with during the Kim affair." "What of him?" "He contacted me 2, maybe 3 hours ago. He said that he felt humiliated because of the manner in which the Kim contract had been implemented, and wanted to make it up to me. He said he'd just received word that a Maladian faction had accepted a contract to carry out a major hit on Coruscant, involving someone closely affiliated with Damask Holdings." Pestige kept his eyes on Palpatine. "I feared it might be you." Palpatine swung back to the window to think. Had the Santhi guards planned to turn him over to the Maladians following the holo communication with Pax's team? He turned to Pestage. "Who took out the contract?" "Members of the Grand Protectorate." "It fits," Palpatine said, more to himself. "What fits? Where are these Grand now?" "As soon as I heard from the Maladian, I asked Kinmim to keep an eye on them. They're holed up in the Malastare ambassador's residence." Palpatine blinked. "Here? On Coruscant?" "Of course, here. It's not possible that they're off-world?" "No, they're downside." Palpatine paced away from Pestage. He opened himself fully to the Force, and was left staggered by an inrush of overwhelming malevolence. He planted his left hand on the desk for support, and managed a stuttering inhale. Somewhere close by, the dark side was unspooling. "Palpatine," Pestage said from behind him. "Hago Damask," Palpatine said, without turning around. Pestage was too stunned to reply. The Grand had turned the table on him, on both of them. Plagueis had been so fixed on executing his own plan that he had neglected to consider that the Gran might also have a plan. How, though? How could he have been so blind? "Ready a speeder, Sate." He heard Pestage leap to his feet. "Where are we headed?" "The Phobosy, the lodge of the Canted Circle." Slumped on his right side, knees drawn up to his chest, eyes open but unmoving, Plagueis watched the second Akani succumb to multiple stabs from the assassin's vibroblades. With blood welling out from under Plagueis's cupped right hand and glistening in a pool on the floor beneath his neck, they had taken him for dead. But now they were moving from the body of one fallen Mume to the next, checking for signs of life and finishing what they had begun. A few had lowered their black hoods. Revealing themselves to be Maladians, the same group Sidious had employed to deal with Vidar Kim. For an instant he wondered if Sidious had secretly taken out a second contract, but he immediately dismissed the thought, born as it was of his not wanting to admit to himself that the Gran had bested him. He wondered if the Maladians had actually been bold enough to kill the prominent Canted Circle members they were impersonating. Unlikely, given that the assassins were known and respected for their professionalism. The members had probably been rendered unconscious by gas or some other means. Not a meter away stood 11-4D, 5 decapitator discs protruding from his alloy body, and telltale lights blinking in the midst of a self-diagnosis routine. Having run himself through a similar test, Plagueis knew that he had lost a great deal of blood, and that one of his subsidiary hearts was in fibrillation. Sith techniques had helped him perform chemical cardioversions on his other 2 hearts, but one of them was working so hard to compensate that it, too, was in danger of becoming arrhythmic. Plagueis moved his eyes just enough to fix the locations of some of the 24 assassins that had survived the Sun Guard's counterattack. Then he dug deep into the force and catapulted himself to his feet. The closest of the assassins swung to him with raised vibroblades and rushed forward, only to be flung backward off the canted stage and against the room's curved walls. Others Plagueis felled with his hands by snapping necks and putting his fists through armored torsos. Spreading his arms wide, he clapped his hands together, turning every loose object in the vicinity into a deadly projectile. But the Maladians were far from run-of-the-mill murderers. Members of the cult had killed and wounded Jedi, and in response to confronting force powers, they didn't shrink or flee but simply changed tactics, moving with astounding agility to surround Plagueis and wait for openings. The wait lasted only until Plagueis attempted to unleash lightning. His second subsidiary heart failed, paralyzing him with pain and nearly plunging him into unconsciousness. The assassins wasted not a moment, throwing themselves at him in groups, though in a vain attempt to penetrate the force shield he raised. Again he rallied, this time with a ragged sound dredged from deep inside that erupted from him like a sonic weapon, shattering the eardrums of those within 10 meters, and compelling the rest to bring their hands to their ears. In blinding motion his hands and feet smashed skulls and windpipes. He stopped once to conjure a force wave that all but atomized the bodies of 6 Maladians. He spun through a turn, dragging the wave halfway around the room to kill half a dozen more. But even that wasn't enough to deter his assailants. They flew against him again, making the most of his momentary weakness to open gashes on his arms and shoulders. Down on one knee, he levitated a Sun Guard blaster from the floor and called it toward him. But one of the assassins succeeded in altering its trajectory by hurling himself into the path of the airborne weapon. With nothing more than the force of his mind, Plagueis rattled the floor, knocking some of the assassins off their feet, but others rushed in to take their places, slashing at him with their vibroblades from every angle. He knew that he had life enough to conjure one final counteroffensive. He was a moment from loosing hell on the Maladians, when he sensed Sidious enter the room. Sidious and Sate Pestage, in whose hands a repeating blaster fashioned a hell of its own, a barrage of light that separated limbs from torsos, hooded heads from cloaked shoulders. Hurrying to Plagueis' side, Sidious lifted him upright, and in unison they brought swift death to the rest. In blinding motion his hands and feet smashed skulls and windpipes. He stopped once to conjure a force wave that all but atomized the bodies of 6 Maladians. He spun through a turn, dragging the wave halfway around the room to kill half a dozen more. In the stillness that followed, 11-4D, glistening with leaked lubricant, re-enabled itself and walked stiffly to where the 2 Sith were standing, syringes grasped in 2 of its appendages. Magister Damask, I can be of service. Plagueis extended his arm toward the droid, and then lowered himself to the floor as the drugs began to take effect. He lifted his gaze to Pestage, then glanced at Sidious, who in turn showed Pestage a look. Master, we need to leave at once, Sidious said. What I felt, the Jedi may have felt, and they will come. Let them, Plagueis rasped. Let them inhale the aroma of the dark side. This carnage is beyond explanation. We can't be here. After a moment, Plagueis nodded and summoned a gurgling voice. Recall the Sun Guard, when they're done here. No, Sidious said. I know where the Gran are. It won't be business as usual this time, Master. The Malastare ambassador's residence occupied 3 mid-tier stories of a slender building located at the edge of the government district. The front of the residence looked out on the standalone galactic courts of the Justice Building, but the rear faced a narrow canyon that was more than 50 levels deep and off-limits to traffic. Following directions furnished by Pestage, Sidious rode turbo lifts and pedestrian walkways to a meager balcony 10 levels above the upper story of the residence. His fury notwithstanding, he would have preferred to linger until nightfall, which came early to that part of Coruscant, but he was certain that the Gran were expecting word that the Maladians had satisfied the terms of the contract, and he couldn't risk having them flee for the stars before he got to them. So he lingered on the balcony until it and the walkway in both directions were unoccupied, then jumped from the overlook and called on the Force to deliver him safely to a narrow ledge that ran beneath the lowest floor of the residence. There he perched only for the time it took to activate the lightsaber he had retrieved from Plagueis' starship, and use it to burn his way into a wide maintenance duct that perforated the building at each level. Crawling to the first egress, a distance of scarcely 10 meters, he lowered himself into a murky storage room and once more called the weapon's crimson blade from the hilt. Constructed to fit the moon's large hand, the lightsaber felt unwieldy in Sidious's, so he switched to a 2-handed grip. Moving with a caution that belied his murderous intent and on the alert for cams or other security devices, he eased out of the room into a tight corridor and followed it toward the front of the building. There, in a formal entryway, 2 Dugs were standing guard in a desultory way. Moving quickly, a blur to human senses, he caught them by surprise, splitting open the chest and abdomen of one and beheading the other, while the first was attempting to prevent his entrails from spilling onto the glossy mosaic floor. A brief scan of the foyer revealed the presence of cams installed in the walls and high ceiling. He wondered how the killings appeared to anyone monitoring a display screen. It must have seemed as if the 2 Dugs had been butchered by a phantom. Still, all the more reason to hurry. He sprinted up the stairs to the next floor, where he heard a cacophony of human voices, muffled by the thick door to a nearby room. Blowing the door inward with a force push, he took a wide stance in the shattered doorway and positioned the blade of the thrumming lightsaber vertically in front of him. Through the weapon's glow he saw a dozen or more Santhe guards in uniform, seated around a table, littered with food and drink containers, gape at him in disbelief before reaching for weapons fastened to their hips, or scurrying for others buried beneath the rubble of their celebratory meal. Sidious waded into the room. returning volleys of blaster bolts from those first to fire, then attacked, raising his left hand to levitate two guards into mid-air before running his blade through each of them. Snarling like a beast, he whirled through a circle, ridding three guards of their heads and cutting a fourth in half at the waist. The blade impaled a guard who had flattened himself to the floor in abject terror, then went straight into the shrieking mouth of the last of them. As that one collapsed in a heap, Sidious caught a glimpse of himself in an ornate mirror, face contorted in rage, red hair in electrified disarray, mouth webbed with strands of thick saliva, eyes a radioactive shade of yellow. He flew back to the stairwell and raced to the top of the next flight, which opened into a large room filled with female Gran and younglings, along with Gran and Doug's servants. Having heard the commotion from below, some were already on their huge flat feet. Others, though, were too shocked to move. All the better for him, and he left not a single one of them alive. Then, through a warren of expensively appointed rooms to another set of closed doors, from behind which issued the sounds of a banquet in progress. One that had probably commenced hours earlier, and wasn't meant to end until hours later, with the deaths of Senator Palpatine, Hugo Damask, and the other moons an accomplished fact. Now Sidious gave full vent to his ire. Crashing through the doors, he landed in the center of a table, covered with plates of grains and grassy plants, and surrounded by a herd of grazing Gran, whose boisterous laughs froze in their throats. From the head of the table, Pax's team gawked at him, as if he might be a creature escaped from his most horrifying nightmare. And yet he wouldn't be the first to taste Plagueis's blade, but the last. Once he had been forced to watch the rest of his party butchered, from hooves to eye stalks, the painted ceiling brought down by Sidious's force pull, the flames of a gentle gas blaze in the room's fireplace incited to a blistering inferno that Sidious tugged behind him as he soared from the table to the floor and closed on his final victim. In desperate flight from the Sith and the spreading flames, Pax's team had backed himself to a tall window framed by floor-to-ceiling curtains. Entreaties of whatever sort tried to thrust themselves through his stricken voice box and past his square teeth, but none succeeded. Deactivating the lightsaber, Sidious beckoned the flames with his fingers, encouraging them to leap from the table to the curtains. A bleeding scream finally emerged from Team's narrow muzzle of a mouth, as the blazing fabric collapsed around him, and Sidious watched him